Hi everyone. So we'll get started for the session today. I'm appreciative of everyone who's joined us for today. My name is Irfan Chaudhry. I'm the director of the Office of Human Rights, Diversity, and Equity at McEwen University. And one of the sessions that I'll be leading in today, unconscious bias and its impact on sport, it really resonates with what one of our speakers from earlier today, Dr. Marvin Washington, was really starting to address in terms of his two thoughts about racial discrimination in hockey. And so what I'm going to do is just maybe do a really deep dive in terms of how we have an appreciation and an understanding of the impact of unconscious bias as it manifests itself within a sports setting and even specifically a hockey setting. And one of the things that I'm hopeful we get out of this session today is just an appreciation of what unconscious bias is and how it manifests itself in the sporting environment. But you'll also see some overlaps in terms of how it might manifest itself in other aspects of your life as well. So just what I ask is if there's any questions, feel free to use the chat screen. We have one of our folks, Aleem, is moderating and monitoring the chat. And so I will make sure to leave some time at the end to, address any questions that we might have. Or my email address is there as well in the event that you want to get in touch with me afterwards. We will be recording this session, and also a copy of the slides will be available to folks to register for this session as well afterwards. So please feel free to just, try to be engaged as much as possible. I have framed it in a way to be as, as interactive as possible in an environment that is virtual. And so again, feel free to kind of engage as you see fit. So what we're going to do by the end of the session, you'll be able to understand what unconscious bias is, understand how unconscious bias can impact the sporting environment, and recognize the types of unconscious bias and its impact on decision making. So what Dr. Marvin Washington had sent with us earlier in terms of his presentation, really focusing in on how some of our biases, especially from the unconscious perspective, does have a strong role in its impact on our decision making. Given the time that we have this afternoon, we likely won't get into too many, examples of how we can counter our biases. I do have some examples of that I will share, but that's also the purpose of this virtual platform that we're developing after this the summit, to be able to really dive into some of these topics, to provide resources, support, education, and awareness around how unconscious bias impacts our decisions, but also what can we do to counter our unconscious biases. So in this session, I just ask that we all kind of engage respectfully, assume positive intent, and of course, speaking your truth. And I've really valued, I've been monitoring all the chats that have been happening throughout the sessions today, and it's just been really empowering to see just how honest and vulnerable and open people have been around the reality of the situation that we're trying to address related to racial discrimination in hockey. And we have captured all the comments and questions, and so rest assured, everything that has been shared will be looked at and answered if there's any questions, to be able to ensure that we are addressing this in a meaningful and positive way. So when we talk about unconscious bias, what is it? When faced with situations or people, we use mental maps and patterns to classify them by making a number of automatic associations. Not surprisingly, our perceptions and assumptions based on these automatic associations are not always correct. And so the biggest thing to kind of keep in mind with this type of a discussion that we're trying to address with unconscious bias, we all have biases. And I think that's one thing we all have to be aware of and acknowledge and know that it impacts all of us. What's the challenge with acknowledging our biases is sometimes we don't even know they're there until we're presented with a situation where all of a sudden our biases come up. And now if we don't have that awareness of what that bias might be, we might inadvertently be acting on it. And one of the things I often get asked in terms of, when we talk about unconscious bias, we are looking at some of those individual, aspects that, fuel and drive some of our unconscious biases. But we're also looking at it from that systemic perspective, right? If everyone's kind of having the same discussions or the same negative stereotypes or the same assumptions connected to certain demographics, Well, that's the systemic piece of unconscious bias that we're trying to really, address. Some of the examples, if you go back to the first hot stove, where both Lali and Devin shared of their experiences as visible minority players and an Indigenous player within a hockey setting, and the negative comments that they received are really strong examples of, the overt forms of discrimination and racism that people experience and people and players of color experience, but also the systemic issue of what to do and where to go and how to address it. And I think that was a common thread and a common theme that I observed in some of the comments where, even at the junior or minor hockey level, where do we go or who do we go to report this? And so, the NHL earlier shared the example of, a confidential line or an information line or a safe disclosure line that they're, starting to develop, which is a good step. But if we're being, realistic here, that's, a step that's been around for a number of years that many organizations have already had in terms of addressing, unethical or discriminatory behavior in their own institutions. So I think being mindful of some of the gaps that are out there, but also trying to figure out what some of the best practices are, does allow those opportunities for reporting to occur. And that's also another way that we can provide mechanisms to support, when we see unconscious biases or very, very conscious biases play out in very, very real ways. So part of learning about unconscious bias is realizing that our brains are capable of making assumptions and creating mental shortcuts without us even being aware, right? So that's the key component we're really trying to, be mindful of here. It's those assumptions, those mental shortcuts that we all make, we all do, without us being consciously aware, right? One of the examples you can even think about is how, we treat our brains and the way we categorize things as, file folders on our computer. And we try to really categorize things in a clean and efficient way that makes sense to our understanding. So we're doing categories, we're doing, frameworks, we're doing different aspects that help us, be able to recall that information quite well. Our minds do the same thing when we see someone that we connect to a certain demographic, a certain faith, a certain religion, other social identity factors. And when we have those connections that categorize people, if we have unchecked biases, sometimes assumptions are what categorize individuals versus, the reality of who they are as a person, as an identity, as a community. And so that's where you see the real impact of unconscious bias as it manifests itself in very, very real ways. So an unconscious bias is an implicit attitude, stereotype, motivation, or assumption that can occur without one's knowledge, control, or intention. Unconscious bias is a result of our life experiences and affects all of us, right? Examples of unconscious bias include gender bias, cultural bias, age bias, language bias, and of course, institutional bias. So whether it's, connections around gender identity, gender expression, and feeling welcome or included in a sporting environment or a locker room. You have cultural bias where you oftentimes will say, people from your background shouldn't play this sport or don't play that sport or shouldn't be good at this sport. Age bias, you see that unfortunately quite a bit in professional sports, that once someone reaches a certain age, sometimes there's biases that come in around performance, and being mindful of, the impact that, high level sports does have on bodies, but also being mindful of how sometimes that's an early, space where people start to let their unconscious bias creep in. And now they're essentially, moving this person to the exit door without realizing that maybe some of their biases might be fueling their understanding or their influence. A lot of you in the chat screen actually talked quite a bit about hockey culture with various mechanisms of how it allows, racial discrimination to continue. And, that's a classic example of institutional bias. When your institutions, when your organizations, where your sectors don't have policies, processes, systems in place to address, key aspects that lead to both, overt and covert forms of discrimination, that's institutional bias, right? So I think there was an example around, a specific rule in a level of hockey that unless the racial slur is physically heard by the official, it's not going to be addressed. That is a classic example of an institutional bias that limits an ability to take racial discrimination complaints seriously, but also the ability to respond and ensure your team, your players, your coaches, your volunteer staff, your parents, everyone feels connected and supported when these do happen on the ice. And, someone shared another example where a racial slur about 2 days ago was uttered to assistant coach for a soccer league, and both teams, when they heard this happen, left the field, stopped the game. And I think that's a powerful statement. When you aren't able to address it in efficient ways, then you see those forms of positive disruption, in my opinion, that allow those types of things to get the appropriate acknowledgement that they deserve, so it's addressed in an efficient and appropriate way. So when we talk about biases, their shortcuts our brains form based on our own culture, our own experiences, things other people tell us, institutional influences like I just spoke about, and of course, other external influences. So the focus of this session today will really be on the external influences that might impact our ability to view a situation or a circumstance or a demographic as it relates to external influences that connect to our unconscious biases. And the biggest external influence I'm referring to here is media, both mainstream media and social media. And I'll go through some examples of how you've seen this happen in a sporting environment that does impact, performance evaluation, that does impact assumptions around, what type of characteristic and attribute is fueling a player's success based on descriptions from media narratives that also fuel our narratives of understanding situations. So it is going to get a little bit uncomfortable here in the next few moments, but I'm doing that in the sense of really trying to unravel where unconscious biases do come from and how they are impacting individuals. I think that's the biggest thing we want to make sure we remind ourselves. Even though these are unconscious biases we're trying to address and be aware of, they still have real world impacts. I think Lali was the one that shared the mental health aspect. Being scared to come to the rink to face your own coach or your own teammates because of some of the assumptions or negative stereotypes that are connected to your identity. And that's really, really powerful when you think about it in that context of it's your own team, let alone an opposing team. So an unconscious bias, attitudes, stereotypes, and beliefs that can affect how we treat each other. So while not intentional, they can still impact how we view others based on race, ability, gender, culture, language, gender identity, gender expression, religion, age, so on and so forth. These would all be classified as categories that would be protected under various human rights legislation. So in Alberta, for example, where I am, we have the Alberta Human Rights Act, where race, ability, gender, country of origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. We have 15 protected grounds under 5 protected areas that the Alberta Human Rights Act protects people against discrimination. Most, countries have some form of human rights legislation that would apply. And so I often bring this as a reminder, right? It's not just the right thing to do and the appropriate thing to do to be able to address, discrimination and racial discrimination specifically for our purposes, but there's also some legislation and some compliance to legislation that is driving a lot of these types of initiatives so that your organization is acting in appropriate ways without inadvertently, having racial discrimination happen, and now you might be liable and open for a human rights complaint. This diagram, I like this a lot. I use it in quite a bit of the trainings I do here at McCUNY University. It's from catalyst.org, which does a lot of training in this area for a corporate environment, an organizational development environment. It talks about how unconscious bias leads to discrimination. And so really what we're going to be working through today is this cycle of how a stereotype, which is a widely held, preconceived, and oversimplified image or idea about a person, group, or thing, can lead to that unconscious bias. So an automatic association or stereotype or attitude about someone's race or gender, for example. It operates beyond our control and awareness, but it does inform our perception of a person or a social group. It can also influence our decision-making and behavior toward the target of the bias. It is a powerful predictor of our behavior. So when you have stereotypes that fuel unconscious biases, that leads to prejudging, right? An attitude about a person or group of people that is based on a belief or stereotype. So think about this in terms of a continuum, right? You have a stereotype that fuels an unconscious bias, and that unconscious bias leads to prejudging. And that will lead to the other areas that we'll talk about later on. But this is where, if we're able to catch our unconscious biases before it gets to that space of prejudging that has real impacts on behavior and that can lead to discrimination, that's really where we want to start to catch it, not just on an individual perspective, but also have those systems in place to be able to catch it from that broader context. So we talk a lot about individuals and organizations having, sessions like these that walk, their clients and their teammates and their staff members, their employees, they all get unconscious bias training. And that's a good start, but it's not enough, right? We really have to start building systems that provide us to be able to supplement and enhance our action when we are made aware of our unconscious biases. And there's many, many examples out there, which unfortunately I don't have time to get into today, but we will be sharing in follow-up resource development in terms of what can be considered. So the Player Development Project has done some interesting work in this area, and they have an example around how unconscious bias, impacts a coaching environment. And so, they have some information. And again, this will all be shared with you afterwards with all the links available for you to access afterwards in terms of where we're getting these resources from. But they tried to really have an understanding of how stereotypes impacted being not just a fair coach, but an effective coach. And what they found that with limited exposure, so this goes back to how unconscious bias influences all of us, especially from those external influences from media and social media, information. With limited exposure, coaches rely on stereotypical information about players that might have a very, very different background. So assuming someone from, country X has, attribute A because previous individuals from that same country also had that same attribute, right? It's an assumption. It's fueled by, stereotypical information, and it's also an unconscious bias that allows to get unchecked if it's not being kind of counterbalanced with other information. So research in the last decade has proven time and again that we tend to favor those that we have a lot of common with. So that's similarity bias. And so this is where coaches might filter new information and film about players to fit their preconceived notions and confirm their initial perception. So confirmation bias. Similarity bias and confirmation bias are probably the two most common biases you see operating, every day. And unless we have that, counterbalancing information, that's where it's allowed to perpetuate, right? Not to call out any specific groups or individuals connected to those groups, but there's been a number of discussions around how certain boards, sporting boards in Canada, don't reflect the diversity of our population, and that can really go down to how folks are being recruited, where the talent pool is coming from, but also when it goes unchecked, how similarity bias and confirmation bias play a role in who continues to get selected to these really influential board positions and who's not invited to the table, or who gets missed out because there isn't that similarity bias that reconnects with confirmation bias. So to the same degree, coaches might overestimate the ability of those players that belong to a group as opposed to outsiders, right? So in-group versus out-group type of a bias. And we'll get to this a little bit later on as well near the end. But really what we're trying to understand here is when we speak of unconscious bias, we are talking about decisions that people make that are happening outside their conscious awareness, but nevertheless have a systemic pattern to them, right? So even though we're trying to address unconscious bias at an individual level, when these unconscious biases lead to decisions that have a systemic pattern to them, this is really why we have to start challenging it, right? And then when we go back to some of the examples shared earlier, both from our speakers, but also in the panelists, whether it's a microaggression and assumptions around someone's, hair or hijab, whatever it might be, or it's more derogatory in terms of a racial slur said on the ice and goes unchecked. When you're seeing these stories being shared in, similar environments, similar demographic impacts, similar spaces where people are just wanting to play a game that they love, that's where that systemic pattern has a very, very strong influence of why it's important to understand the impact of our unconscious biases. So what I'm going to walk us through in the next few slides here. So for those of you that might be listening along, or maybe just have a sense of what we're going to be working through on the screen here. I'm going to walk us through a couple of activities to kind of just showcase how easily our unconscious bias, shows up in very, very mundane ways. And so the first example that I like to use is the Stroop Effect, and some of you might be familiar with it. But what the Stroop Effect is talking about is how our embedded knowledge about our environment impacts how we interact with it. So it's talking about our automatic associations, when they're triggered, are able to easily show up automatically without going unchecked. And while that might seem like an efficient way of making decisions and going about our daily lives, that's also where our unconscious biases sometimes play a role. So with the Stroop effect, it's looking at how we associate certain colors with certain names. And so when we have these automatic associations, our brains fire faster and more confidently when we see the name in the color compared to when we see the name in an opposing color. So I'm going to walk you through 2 slides here where we're going to do that activity together, being mindful that I'm not going to have a sense of how quickly everyone will be going through this. I'll introduce the activity. I'll give maybe about a minute of silence on my end to allow folks to do the activity, and then I'll continue on there. So with this first slide, what I want you to do is don't necessarily time yourself, but just pay attention to how quickly you can read the following text. Focus only on the text and ignore the colors the words are printed in. So what you want to do is read the text all the way to the end, ignoring the colors the words are printed in. So for example, it would be blue, orange, yellow, red, and I'll just have you continue. So what you might have observed with your kind of own self-assessment of this, you likely were able to kind of go at a comfortable pace. You likely were able to kind of read this at the same pace that you often read other things. And that's what this activity is meant to kind of highlight, right? Being able, when you have these automatic associations that you're able to kind of read through quite quickly, that's the Stroop effect kind of in action in part 1. The second aspect of the Stroop effect, we're going to do the exact same thing, but in the opposite direction. So now what I want you to do is state the colors of the following words and ignoring the actual text. So now instead of the text, you're focusing on the colors. And, so orange, pink, green, purple. Pay attention to how quickly you're able to go through this activity. So for this one, you might have noticed that you might not have been as fast as the previous one. You might have caught yourself maybe stopping and trying to, for a split second, ensure your mind is in capturing the appropriate answer as best as possible. And that's the example of how we're trying to catch our unconscious biases. So even that split second where you take that moment to stop your automatic association to get to the most appropriate answer, that's how we can challenge that Stroop effect in terms of how we understand unconscious bias. So I'll be honest with you, when this was first introduced to me as an activity, it was by our former president of the university, who was a neuroscience by profession. I didn't know what she was talking about. And I just kind of smiled and nodded and said, yeah, for sure. The Stroop effect, unconscious bias, I get it. I didn't get it at all. So I did some research. I kind of looked into it further. And this is where it really started to help me understand just how powerful and impactful the Stroop effect is in terms of what we're trying to understand, right? So what the Stroop effect is essentially talking about is how our embedded knowledge about our environment impacts how we interact with it. So when we have those same embedded unconscious biases that lead to automatic associations, when they go unchallenged, we just continue on with our day as if nothing needs to be looked at in a broader context. And so we see the same effect when we try to get our brains to process other assumed paired words, right? So think about certain genders and disciplines they're involved with. So men and science, certain genders and characteristics. So women being nurturing, And so these, again, are assumed paired words that we have that unless we check our biases, we assume that everyone that might have that same gender identity or visibly present as a specific gender has those same characteristics. And then when we are challenged with that, it challenges our own assumptions, right? So here's an example, I would like all of us to kind of work through as well. This is a very recent picture from CBC News. It's talking about how Calgary bar and gym owners are going to be impacted by, the latest Alberta COVID-19 measures. Without having any further information about the two images and the headline there, your brain is automatically assuming who is the gym owner and who is the restaurant owner. Again, based on your own experiences, your own assumptions, your own understanding, and some of it might confirm your, assumption. Others might be surprised by their assumption, right? So in this context, the person on the left is the gym operator and owner, and the person on the right is the restaurant and pub owner, right? So it's even those everyday interactions of how our assumptions around certain identities, certain professions, are just assumed to be, what it is. And that's the challenge of understanding our unconscious biases, right? Because we only know what we know. And if we aren't aware of how our unconscious biases are impacting our world in many different ways, then, sometimes people might say ignorance is bliss, but also ignorance is where it gets us to having these types of, sessions where we really want to start to unpack this and understand how we can affect change through systemic ways, right? And understanding unconscious bias is just one of those things. So take that same example, that same framework, that same context of the Stroop effect, and how we have automatic assumptions connected to identities. And now let's look at this in the framing of media and media stories and player characteristics. So the question I have that I'm going to pose to all of you is, how does race and media framing influence how athletes are believed? So you see that there's 4 kind of labels there. I'm going to slowly go through each image, and all I'll ask you to do is just think to yourself, when you see the following players, what words would you use to describe them to another person, right? So again, when you think of the following players and you'll see their images on the screen, what words would you use to describe them to another person? So we have Sidney Crosby. And for those that might be comfortable, feel free to also use the chat screen. I apologize, the way I have it set up, I'm not able to see this chat screen at the same time. But I think it's, another way I'll be able to, share what people might be saying. Okay, next image, our very own, I'm in Edmonton, of course, Connor McDavid. So what do you think of the following players? What words would you use to describe them to another person, right? In terms of their skill set, their ability, I don't want to guide anything here, so I'll stop. But just think about the words and maybe, jot them down even if you want to see where you might be stemming from. PK Subban. So when you think of the following players, what words would you use to describe them to another? And then Evander Kane, right? So all professional hockey players at the highest of levels, all playing within the NHL, around the same kind of demographic age bracket as well. But there's been a lot of, kind of media descriptions and assumptions, and even from sports analysts, in terms of, characteristics and skill and behavior and, fit and so on and so forth, which are all really coded words that we look at from a microaggression perspective of in-group versus out-group, right? So going back to what Dr. Marvin Washington was talking about earlier as well. So there was, and I'll share this with everyone afterwards as well, it'll be in the resource section. There was a really interesting study done a number of years back that looked at this question. It looked at how does race and media framing describe how athletes are influenced. And analysis of media descriptions highlighted that white athletes' success is attributed to character, personality, mental attributes. So an example, if a good play is made on the field, on the ice, on the court, it is described as a result of the decision-making leadership smarts of the white identifying player. So in this study, what they found, how does race and media framing influence how athletes are described? So again, these were from media reports, news reporters following and sharing and writing articles about athletes in various sports. Common descriptors for white athletes were heady, smart, intelligent, dependable, steady, tough, hardworking, leader, crafty, clever, determined, advanced, durable, slick, versatile, relentless, resourceful, courageous, aware, having character, and being competitive. So what they found in the study was 62% of the content in terms of what was being described as their, characteristics and their success was connected to mental attributes. When the same study did the same breakdown for Black athletes, and this was not specific to any sport, this was professional sports is all it was limited to, so NHL, NFL, NBA, so on and so forth. The same media analysis, when you look at race and media framing, described the highlights and success of Black athletes being attributed to physical presence, being described in savage type terms, so having like animalistic characteristics, whatever that might mean, going even more broadly to being supernatural, machine-like. So the example that they found is a common thread. If a good play is made on the field, on the ice, on the court, it's described as a result of their natural physical abilities versus any mental capacity that they may also possess. And that was the essence of what this study was trying to highlight, is there is a discrepancy when athletes are being described and framed around success. White players often get the benefit of the mental attributes for their success, whereas with racialized players, it oftentimes was around the physical aspect. And so in that same study, what they found is common descriptions for Black athletes have, again, he's an animal on the field. He's a monster, fast, quick, superhuman, agile, what a freak, talented, gifted, natural ability, strong, powerful, big, a missile, torpedo, a beast, athletic, muscular, speedy, explosive, terrifying, scary, big, massive, huge. 78% of the content being described connected to physical attributes. So this is where we go back to what we're talking about, how unconscious bias leads to discrimination. If you have media framing around certain identities connected to sporting capacity and sporting success, and is being fueled by, let's say, different forms of labeling and stereotypical reference points in media articles that might also be fueling your understanding of that same context, this is exactly where we see how stereotype leads to an unconscious bias, leads to prejudging, leads to behavior. Who you go to when the play is really critical, right? Because you assume they possess, characteristic A, B, or C because of maybe an unchecked bias. Who you don't go to in the similar situation, right? So I know there's often aspects related to skill and ability and, all those other aspects, but we're really trying to dive into the root of, before we even get to those decision making, what type of biases might be fueling who we put out on the ice at certain times, who we might not dress, who we might not coach in similar ways, right? I go back to the university setting, right? I work at a university, and similar aspects of unconscious bias also occur here, right? How instructors, when you look at similarity bias, naturally gravitate to students who might be like them in various social identity factors, and as a result are, without their realization, paying more attention to that student or providing better support to that student, and inadvertently ignoring other students who might not have that same level of similarity connection to the instructor. You see the same thing in other environments, right? Whether it's employment, whether it's, again, schooling, whether it's sporting, all those different types of unconscious biases do have real impacts on our behavior, which can lead to discrimination. An action that follows prejudice, denial of opportunity, unequal treatment regarding selection, promotion, etc. Right? It's one of the reasons why, and there's mixed results on the success of it, but it's one of the reasons why a number of years back the NFL introduced the Rooney Rule, right? So ensuring that when there's a head coaching job available, that there's an effective pool and talent pool of racialized coaches to also select from, because there's no way that there is not any pool of skilled, experienced, and professional coaches who don't have a racialized background, right? I think that's one of the reasons why the Rooney Rule was enacted as one way to be able to establish it. And like I said, there's been a lot of discussion of whether the Rooney Rule needs to be, impacted in other sports. From what I've read, there's still some inconsistent, measures around the success of the implementation of the rule, but that's just one example. So I won't go into this in too much detail because I do want to give some time to look at some of the comments and maybe take any questions there. But these are some of the examples that we see around unconscious bias, right? So Dr. Washington did reference some of them in his presentation, but I just want to maybe allude to some of them at a very, very high level, right? So something called anchoring bias, making a judgment based on a reference point. Bias blind spot. So this is one all of us have, our own weaknesses, failing to recognize one's own bias, or, flat out ignoring them. Oftentimes you'll see, well, my gut told me to make this decision. Sometimes your gut might be giving you a biased direction, right? And I think if we're aware of that, or are allowing ourselves to be influenced by other information that's allowing us to counteract, our gut feeling, then at least we're having a holistic view of a situation or an understanding of a situation. We talked a little bit about confirmation bias. So looking for more information that supports one's existing theories. In a university, we're guilty of that, right? We train our students when they're doing papers, for example, find research and resources that support what your argument is that you're trying to make. And not saying to not include alternative points of views, but you get so focused on trying to find information that confirms your perspective that as a result, you might not be looking at another alternative or another perspective. You also have halo and horns effect, right? You see this quite a bit in the hiring and interview process, right? Someone you're interviewing for a position, they say or do something within the interview, and as a result, it connects with you in a very, very positive way. So it might have that confirmation bias in play. And now they have like a symbolic halo around their head where literally they can do or say anything else, and you've already made your decision of this is the person for you. You also see the horns effect, right? Same exact scenario, but the person might respond or say something to a question that maybe doesn't, connect with you on a number of ways, even though it might be a good answer, but you're switched off. You're like, this person's not the person for the role. Your notes from the interview now turn into you making, a grocery list. You've not, you logged off. You're not paying attention. And so you see the halo and horns effect happen quite a bit in many scenarios, and hiring and interviewing is just one of them. You also have the leniency effect, so treating some individuals or groups in a more lenient way than others. Again, this goes back to that aspect of in-group versus out-group. You see a lot of this at a professional level. There's so many examples where, North American players are given more leniency, or the perception of leniency, than European players in terms of chances to succeed. Versus, European players, Russian players specifically, you see that example when Don Cherry was sharing his hateful narratives on the air before he got pulled off. That's where you really have the impact of the media, right? When you have a powerful spokesperson who is framing, to what I would argue, very divisive language around nationalism, identities, and skill set, that influences people's assumptions. That influences people's perceptions. Now that influences people's treatment on the ice, right? I think that's something really important to always be mindful of, and how powerful that language can be and its influence it has on our understanding and assumptions, right? So I won't go into these in too much detail. Like I said, I will share all this afterwards. The last thing I just wanted to share before I kind of go back to the chat screen and connect with any questions or comments anyone wants to add, is understanding the impacts of unconscious bias. So we have some good news and bad news that we can kind of share, right? We are living in a world right now where bad news seems to be the norm. I will share some bad news, but there's also some hope here that I'm trying to leave with as we kind of conclude the session. So on the bad side of things, bias does impact our decisions. Unconscious bias is prevalent in upwards of 80% of decisions that are made. This, of course, affects diversity and inclusiveness of the teams that we create. In this context, the faculty we mentor or support, but in the context of the sporting environment, your coaches, your assistant coaches, your volunteers, your other individuals involved in the sporting environment. Again, when you recruit volunteers, are you pulling from a broad pool, right? That's the other aspect that we have to consider in terms of making sure we're reflective and aware of our biases in all aspects of the sporting environment. Students we guide and encourage, and more broadly, the community that we serve. But the good news is we can do something about this. And again, I want to applaud all of you for spending the time with me this afternoon, because this is the step that you've taken to be able to be aware and to some degree re-educate your awareness and acknowledge the impact of bias. And so the goal isn't necessarily to eliminate it. You know, that's impossible. Like I said, we all have our own biases that have been ingrained through our own experiences, but it's being aware of it and it's being able to avoid it. Because when we're able to have our unconscious biases checked and balanced with other perspectives and viewpoints, we lead to making better outcomes and better decisions. So at the end of the day, when we understand our unconscious biases and we try to act to neutralize them, whether through education sessions, whether through our policies, whether through our committee development, whether through our hiring processes, that's how we can get to the steps towards, real inclusion. As we've talked about today and the experiences that people have shared within a hockey environment, and I know other sports are not immune from this at all, there's a long way to go, right? But I think as a starting point, if we're able to understand where our biases are kicking in to impact decisions that are being made, that at the end of the day not only impacts current players, but future players. And, I remember taking my son, to skating lessons over the last number of years, prior to COVID, of course, and just seeing how diverse the youngsters were in terms of learning how to skate. Some maybe going, with the interest of joining hockey and playing on a team. But I think that's where we really have to understand that whether we're ready or not, that diversity is coming. And if we're not ready and prepared to make sure we're acting in inclusive ways, and again, just go back to some of the examples that were shared in the sessions today, that's really where we have to start to take a look and understand how unconscious bias, when it goes unchecked, does lead to a strong lack of inclusion that does have real impacts around mental health, around inclusion, around belonging, and other aspects that are really important around social identity and building social cohesion. And so the last thing I'll share, what ways to address your bias. Again, we won't have time to go into in too much detail, but there's the source for anyone that's interested. It goes back to that first example around coaching, right? So how to counteract bias, unconscious bias within coaching, trying to seek the input from colleagues and staff, right? Also with the assumption that your colleagues and staff are reflective of diverse viewpoints, diverse identities, diverse frameworks. Because if that's not the case, if you go to a room and try to seek input from someone who looks like you, you're going to get the same response, right? Self-awareness. So, sessions like this, providing all staff members and coaches with continuous opportunities to reflect about their own biases and realign as a team, right? I'm only saying this just for information. I'm not trying to get any kind of plug out here. But one of the things we've committed to at MacEwan is we've created a continuing education course around really diving into unconscious bias. So it gets into these topics, but even the theories and motives behind them in terms of understanding just how impactful and influential they are in a variety of sectors, right? So being able to build our knowledge and awareness, but then also acting on them. So whether through regular one-on-one meetings with, your players, there's no better answer to softening a stereotype than exposure to people of a group who might not be like you, who might be different from you. And as a result, you are able to break down some of those, barriers that might be there as a result of unconscious biases. And the last thing I will share, the whole purpose around the summit today is, again, to share experiences, share stories, share our understandings, but more broadly, really trying to develop an understanding of what resources might be needed, what understandings might be needed for resource development. And so, again, most of you that signed up were able to provide us with some input around what resources might be supportive to you as you go down this journey of making hockey more inclusive. But we will be sending a follow-up survey as well that will also allow you to provide that feedback. So with that, I will kind of turn my mic off and just open it up to see if there's any questions or comments anyone has shared. I'm just going to look through here. So I have a good comment here from Jennifer. Unconscious bias occurs because decision policy creations are often made by people that are not part of the community. And you see that strong narrative, right? Of, this can no longer be about us without us. And I think it's very important to have folks that are impacted, not only be at the table as, a consulting, arm once decisions have been made, but as an arm of decision making. And so making sure that you have the people at the table, not just, hearing from their experiences and then going away and doing your own thing. It's really, taking examples we've heard today and building that into action, right? So really being able to have the impacts of understanding and awareness of even that layer of how decisions are made without people being at the table to make those information or support information making. So yeah, really good comment there. I think when we were referencing the Rooney Rule, right? So one of the reasons, being hard being hard for people of color to be, a quarterback in the NFL, for example, or even more broadly, an owner, or a head coach or a GM, right? I think these are all aspects that really get broken down. That's why, for example, the MLB made some really interesting headlines a few weeks back when I believe the Florida Marlins appointed the first ever female GM in MLB history. I think that's a phenomenal, aspect that needs to be kind of showcased, but also it's a good reminder of, it's almost 2021, and we're still having these types of discussions and, conversations around really trying to understand what is it about some of the limitations we do see in success at higher levels of sports and other organizations that make these stories newsworthy versus the norm, right? So I think that's one aspect to really think about as well. So I'm seeing just some questions or comments earlier. I think it's again, I just want to have that strong caveat, and I always do this as a reminder at my own institution as well. I think having these types of sessions and information options and education and awareness, initiatives are a good starting point for a lot of organizations and a good space for development. But again, it's really important to make sure you just don't have your behavioral, aspect of unconscious bias addressed. What about your institutional biases, right? So if you're doing all these trainings, but yet your processes, policies, and procedures are still the exact same without any changing, then you're not going to see really any strong impact, right? So I think that's a really strong consideration that, the education piece is a good starting point, but it needs to go beyond that as well. All right. So just being mindful of time, I just want to say if there's anyone else that has any final thoughts or comment that they would like to add or share, feel free to do so in the chat screen. Otherwise, again, I really want to take all of you for taking the time today to share with us, to listen with us, to learn with us. I know being on a screen for 3+ hours can definitely be very, very challenging. So I do appreciate everyone's engagement and ability to be here today. Otherwise, if there's nothing else, I look forward to reconnecting with many of you when we share information about the summit. And at any time, feel free to reach out. We are trying to co-develop resources that we're hoping will be available in March, April of 2021. So if there's anything you would like to see, anything you would like to see added, I'll also keep my email address there as well. Another one you can reach me at. Feel free to send the information that way, or send it through the survey that we're going to be sending shortly. Otherwise, have a good rest of the day. And thank you so much for joining me. And again, we appreciate your time for our session today. Have a good one, everyone.